Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Bryte, the brand new tabletop role-playing game that is emerging from Roll20, the virtual tabletop provider that is currently associated with many tabletop role-playing games within the tabletop role-playing game industry. So Bryte is a really interesting tabletop role-playing game that's emerging for multiple reasons. So let's talk about it, okay? So one, let me just define real quick what Bryte is. Bryte is it's a tabletop role-playing game. It is specifically designed from the ground up to work on a VTT, a virtual tabletop. There are currently primarily two virtual tabletops within the tabletop role-playing game industry. There is Roll20 and there is Fantasy Grounds. Roll20 is primarily web-based, and Fantasy Ground is an install application. I think you download it and actually install it on your computer. And so those two are going head-to-head in competition, right? Honestly, as I look at it, it looks to me like Roll20 is way ahead of Fantasy Grounds. Like, they're not even, I don't think they're really in the same league personally, right? Now, I will say, let me be clear. I am a physical tabletop guy. Have been for a long time, and so, I'm just kind of dipping my toe into researching these VTTs, and one of the reasons why is they have become an absolute major component of tabletop role-playing games, and it can no longer be denied that online games are an absolutely massive part of the tabletop role-playing game scene. And I think it's very clear there are more online games right now than there are physical games, period. End of sentence. That's just a reality of the hobby, I think, at this point. All right, so Bryte is a tabletop role-playing game. It's being built from the ground up by Roll20 to work on their VTT, on the Roll20 virtual tabletop. Now, what's really unique about that is by taking this action, Roll20 is now a competitor with every single tabletop role-playing game that is facilitated on their platform, okay? Now, that is surprising, but it is absolutely not unusual. There are many businesses. A grocery store is a perfect example of this. Many grocery stores carry branded food and then run their own store brand right there in their store, competing with brands that are being sold on their own store shelves. It's a little confusing because you would expect that this would alarm the majority of companies that are being facilitated on your platform, right? Excuse me. But like I said, it absolutely is not unusual in other industries. It's very common in other industries for a platform provider to be serving up one instance of the thing that they serve. In this case, Roll20 serves up tabletop role-playing games. It makes a space where tabletop role-playing games can be played online, right? Now, the thing that with Bryte is specifically a tabletop role-playing game that was built from the ground up and has been specifically built to use the power of Roll20 in unique ways that games that were built primarily to be played on physical tables will not be able to do this. For instance, let me tell you a few things about Bryte, the tabletop role-playing game. One, it is another item about Bryte is it is a science fiction setting. I think one of the reasons why they're doing that is so that they can incorporate some of the electronic aspects of the game directly as a meta into the setting itself, right? So, with that said, additionally, for instance, the Bryte tabletop role-playing game, there are instances where players are going to be rolling 35 separate dice, right? The game makes it so that you can use random tables very quickly, very natively. Those tables are built into the game from the very beginning. In addition to that, your player characters and your non-player characters are integrated. The tokens for those player characters and for the non-player characters are integrated into maps for the game directly, right? So it would seem like this would give a tabletop role-playing game that was built from the ground up to be played on a VTT some advantages over the literally dozens, maybe well over 100 tabletop role-playing games that are currently played on Roll20 that were built for physical tabletops. So this is a very interesting choice on the part of Roll20. One of the things I think two of the key players in this are Nolan T. Jones and James Intro Casso. So let's talk about them for a minute. So Nolan T. Jones is a co-founder for Roll20, and he has recently been in TRPG news headlines for reasons that have nothing to do with Burn Bryte, and have more to do with some drama that recently has kind of cropped up around Roll20. I have carefully watched that situation, and I have not touched it on my on my TRPG commentary. And the reason why is it is very complicated, and I do not know where I stand overall, right? In that, I think it's a complicated situation, and I'm still formulating exactly where the factions are in that whole situation. But let's put it this way: Roll20. There's a few things happening with Roll20 right now. Roll20 is literally managing some of the recent comments by Nolan T. Jones that have nothing to do with Burn Bryte, right? In addition, Roll20 is bringing out its own tabletop role-playing game built from the ground up to be played on its VTT, right? At the same time, Roll20 is continuing to maintain its position as one of the very, very top tier VTTs, virtual tabletops, in the entire industry, and they facilitate. I'm pretty sure they facilitate well over 100 different tabletop role-playing games that are played on Roll20, right? So they're absolutely a major part of the industry overall, right? And they're really in a very unique position to impact the industry and, of course, be impacted by the industry, right? So this choice to create Burn Bryte and dive into the pool of competitors and say, we're not just a facilitator, we're not just a platform provider anymore, we are a direct competitor with FFG, with Wizards of the Coast, we are a TRPG game creator, puts them in a very unique position, because now, just like many other companies, they have to be very careful about how they manage that tabletop role-playing game. Okay, so Nolan T. Jones is in there, and he has been speaking publicly about Burn Bryte, and explaining what Roll20's intentions are with this game. And one of the things he said was that they had gone to companies that they facilitate and to partners that they have and said, "What do you think of this?" And none of them were overly negative. I think his terms was nobody was too concerned with this choice, right? But it's very, very interesting, and I think it puts Roll20 in an interesting place. It changes their relationship with tabletop role-playing game companies and with people who are partnering to put content onto their platform, right? All right, so Roll20 is now a tabletop role-playing game creator. They're in the middle of creating a tabletop role-playing game. One of the things that's truly interesting is they did not one-cheat this when they went forward. They were very careful about who they chose to build this new tabletop role-playing game. So who did they pick as the primary driver for building Burn Bryte? Well, it's really fascinating. The gentleman's name is James Intro Casso. James Intro Casso is a lot of things. So one of the biggest things that James Intro Casso is, and many people might know James Intro Casso, is podcasting. So he was primarily a podcaster for a while, did a lot of successful, I put that in air quotes, because podcasts are really a very niche market overall. But he's done quite a few he definitely does high quality podcasting. And I've actually listened to some of his podcasts for a while now. But one of the things is, for about a year and a half, he's been really, I think he's been doing less when it comes to podcasting and shifting more into producing content, right? So James Introcaso produces content for tabletop role-playing games, and he has been producing content for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, specifically through the DMs Guild, and I think also through the Adventure League. And just recently, something very special happened with James Introcaso, something which is a huge feather in his cap, right? Which is, he was anointed by Wizards of the Coast by being given a writing credit. His name is listed on Waterdeep Dragon Heist. This is a very, very, very big deal within the tabletop role-playing game circles, and the reason why is, so essentially there are no setting books, right? Generally, there are no setting books. Now, I think that's actually about to change with the Guilds of Ravnica. Guilds of Ravnica is the closest thing we've ever had to a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition setting book, right? Suncoast, I know that's out there. It's I don't really consider that a setting book. It's actually, at best, it's a region book. But generally, the way Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has allowed settings to be attached to the game is they come through adventures, right? Now, essentially, the Dungeons & Dragons tabletop role-playing game right now, when it comes to content, the highest tier of content is a hardback book that is sold in Barnes & Nobles. That is where you have reached the pinnacle of content within Dungeons & Dragons. And the reason why is, when you have reached that point, your content within Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition sits literally next to the PHB, the DMG, and the MM. That is the holy grail of every edition. That is, in my opinion, what really defines an edition, literally defining the rules, defining the settings overall at a generic level. And so James Introcaso scrabbled his way through literally well over 100 high-end competitors, right? The people competing to be on these books, everybody under the sun wants to be on these books. The DMs Guild, which is a new website that Wizards of the Coast has, where you can take your content and put it online and say, this is now for sale as a Dungeons & Dragons adjacent product. I don't think you can even put 5th edition on it. You can't put 5e on it. There's some really unusual rules around what can be created for Dungeons & Dragons. And Wizards of the Coast overall, like, they really detest the idea of editions, right? And I definitely get that. Editions are, when you start talking about editions, it's just saying, every time, whatever this number is, that's when we flip the table on on everybody who collects this game and made a whole bunch of their books darn near worthless, right? So, the numbers are bad reminders, especially when you're up around 3, 4, 5 and higher, right? And you'll see in tabletop role-playing games, anytime there's editions over 3, 4, 5, almost always, they won't even list a number on the book anymore, right? But James Introcaso, in order to be listed on Waterdeep Dragon Heist, his name is listed as a contributor, as a writer on that book. He had to scrabble through just an immense amount, MT Black and, a whole bunch of other direct competitors who are putting up, the best product they possibly can on DM Guild, who are, keeping robust and maintained content on Twitter, who are, publicly commentating on Dungeons & Dragons, who are creating content on a regular basis, who are streaming games, who are creating books, who are, creating YouTube content. There's just an immense amount of Dungeons & Dragons creators out there, and every single one of them would desperately love to be listed as an actual writing contributor on any Dungeons & Dragons official hardback adventure, to have your name listed in the same paragraph as Chris Perkins, who's actually on the design team. And so, I think what that's become is that has become a special anointing, right? Well, James Introcaso, it's almost like a 1, 2, 3 drop, right? So it's really kind of strange to me, the timing of all this, because on the one hand, he's gotten his Dungeons & Dragons anointing, and Wizards of the Coast is kind of blessing the content that he's created and rewarding the content he's created with this writing position, right? I don't think you can make it onto these books without being very, very careful to make sure that Wizards of the Coast is happy with you, happy with your content, happy with your relationship with the community. That is incredibly difficult to manage. And James Introcaso has done that. He has managed it, right? But at the same time, James Introcaso has been working on Burn Bryte, right? So he wrote the rule system for Burn Bryte, one of the very first tabletop role-playing games that have been built from the ground up, right? From the ground up, really abandoning the traditional hardcover book access, and really building a tabletop role-playing game that is built from the very ground up to work on a virtual tabletop, right? And this is huge, right? So within the same few months, James Introcaso is anointed by Wizards of the Coast, saying, you've made it into the inner circle, right? Here you are being listed on Waterdeep Dragon Heist. And at the same time, then James Introcaso is coming forward and saying, hey, look, everybody, I created this game that really kind of flaunts the very foundations of the entire hobby, right? There's a high probability that, that Burn Bryte will never ever have a hardcover hardcover existence, right? And that's pretty unusual within tabletops, right? It's even possible that the way that the rules are built and the structure of the game won't even allow it to be played at a physical table in any way that is reasonable, right? If you right out of the gate, the game has a pool of 35 dice that players are going to be rolling. What game has 35 dice? Well, I'll give you an example of one: Shadowrun, and it's known within the industry as having one of the worst rule sets possible, right? It's literally iconic for having an incredibly good world and a pretty darn bad rule system, right? So, and that's another game I think it's on its 4th or 5th edition, right? Yeah, there's a lot of editions of, I'm pretty sure it's on its 5th edition, right? Man, that's a lot. That is a lot of editions. And again, it's the same number of editions. It's actually, there are more editions of Shadowrun than there are of Dungeons & Dragons. So Burn Bryte is a really, really interesting game. I'm really curious if James Introcaso, I'm curious if he fell into this position, right? Because it would seem to me, if you've finally been given, the thumbs up from the Wizards of the Coast team, I'm not sure then why you would, directly connect yourself to something that seems so completely non-traditional, right? So, but it is very interesting that James Introcaso has gotten the blessing and gotten the full buy-in from the most traditional possible game, Dungeons & Dragons, and from Burn Bryte, right? Which is probably the least traditional tabletop role-playing game that has ever been built, right? In one of the things I think that's going to be really interesting about Burn Bryte is it a tabletop role-playing game or is it a video game, right? And, and that's a really, really interesting question, because if it's a tabletop role-playing game that's been built from the ground up to work with a VTT, that makes it really special. If it's a game where you can have multiple players playing in a video situation and they can control little sprites on a screen, that makes it a multiplayer video game, which is common as dirt, right? So Burn Bryte is either really special or common as dirt, and we're gonna find out, but it's really, really interesting, the people who are involved, the choices that are being made, and the timing that surrounds all of this. So I'm curious what your opinion is on Roll20's decision to make Burn Bryte And I'm also curious if you think James Introcaso handled this situation the way he should have. Like, do you think he did this on purpose? That, you know, within months from each other, he would be announcing this incredibly non-traditional game, and at the same time, his name would be listed right next to Chris Perkins on what really is the most traditional of games right now. It's very interesting, interesting things that have unfolded there. So I'm curious of your opinion on it, and please consider liking and subscribing. Take care.